Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining for the Ambassador William C. Battle Symposium here at the Miller Center. We have 8 days to go in a presidential election, if you hadn't noticed. And when President Trump started his run for the White House in 2015, he made opposing immigration his signature issue. From building a border wall to stopping asylum seekers at the borders and separating families, to restricting visas for highly skilled workers, he has often delivered on his promises, even if not completely, with respect to the border wall. Most public opinion polls show that his immigration policies still only get around or less than 40% of public support. And yet right now, President Trump actually appears to poll slightly better among Hispanic voters today than he did in 2016. Beyond the United States, these policies have had major implications for American diplomacy. That's certainly been the case with respect to our neighbors to the South, in particular here in the Americas. But they've also created a sticking point with other countries around the world. Then again, what is happening here in the United States is not that dissimilar what we're seeing in Europe or in parts of Asia or Africa or Latin America itself. So today's Battle Symposium will explore those topics in a comparative perspective. Those of us who have participated in past Battle Symposia know the event offers an unparalleled opportunity for a deep dive into an area of national interest. From relations with China in our last Battle Symposium to the previous Battle Symposium, which have traveled around the world in their topics. So we're excited to continue this tradition today and take a deep dive into immigration. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute to extend my thanks, and on behalf of the Miller Center, to Barry Battle and her late husband, Bill, who inspire us constantly and make these symposiums possible. As many of you know, Bill's accomplished career was especially distinguished in the area of diplomacy. Bill was a Charlottesville native, a UVA School of Law graduate, and a key player in John Kennedy's presidential campaign. In his own campaign for governor, which garnered him the Democratic nomination here in the state. We remember Bill's decades of philanthropy and commitment to the Charlottesville community, and honor Barry and Bill's devotion to critical conversations, such as the one we're going to have today. Barry, it pains me that we don't get to see you here at the Miller Center, but we really thank you once again for this terrific opportunity. I'm going to hand over the reins for today's event to two wonderful moderators, my two colleagues, Ann Richard and David LeBlanc. Ann is a practitioner senior fellow here at the Miller Center and the Schlesinger Professor, which is our distinguished professorship for former career and other public servants in the area of diplomacy. Ann served as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration under President Obama. And prior to that, Ann was Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for IRC, the International Rescue Committee, and worked in various leadership capacities at the State Department, the Peace Corps, and the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. In addition to her position at the Miller Center, Ann has taught at various prestigious colleges and universities, including the U.S. government in 2017. Thank you, Ann, for being my colleague once again. We served together in the Clinton administration, and for being with us today to guide the conversation. We're really lucky to have you. David LeBlanc is the Randolph P. Compton Professor here at the Miller Center and also serves as the Ambassador Henry J. Taylor and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Endowed Professor of Politics at the university. He also is a professor at UVA's Batten School and has run their Global Policy Center. David is an expert on international political economy. He is currently working on two related works in the topic of immigration. First studies the role that global immigration plays in linking host and home countries and the various implications of those linkages. The second focuses on the destination choices of refugees and legal migrants. David is widely published and, more importantly, a great friend of the Miller Center and a really important colleague in that he manages all of our faculty fellows and practitioner fellows for us. So David, thank you for joining us today and for all that you do for the center. And finally, our first speaker today is Brian Kelly. Brian currently serves as the head of community stabilization for the International Organization for Migration, where he has been since 2000, working in places ranging from the Balkans, Afghanistan, to Nepal. He's an expert in humanitarian operations, community stabilization, building, reintegration, and coordinating relief and recovery programs. David advises for governments, for the UN, for nonprofits, and the private sector. And he's a widely published author in those fields. So we're really excited and appreciative of having you here today with us, Brian, and we're really excited to hear from you. Without further ado, let's get started. And thanks again to Barry and her late husband, Bill, for enabling us to do this great program.
Super. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Miller Center, University of Virginia. Thank you for the introduction, Bill. And I'm speaking instead of the IOM Director General, Antonio Vitorino, who passes his regrets that he could not be here. He really appreciates you extending the invitation, and really he thanks you for the tireless efforts that you've made on behalf of the most vulnerable populations in the world, in your role in the State Department and in your work today. Thanks to everyone with the esteemed panelists, some of the best thought leaders in the world on the issues we are going to discuss. I'm going to speak about global mobility, the US, European, and Australian policy, which the panelists are going to be examining more deeply, and an explanation about my role the UN Migration Agency has as it supports member states and migrants. And to begin, the UN Migration Agency, the International Organization for Migration, we're going to try to use some of the technology of Zoom available to start with a poll. How many of you have heard of us? And so you have three choices, and that will help me understand how deep I'm going to go in the introduction before we get into some of the more weighty matters. And at this time, I am going to share my screen. And I will cover a few of the different points because for 70% of the group, it's either the big winner, today's the first time I've heard of it, or slightly. So IOM, the International Organization for Migration, it was started in 1951, and it was started the same year and shares the same birth year as the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. UNHCR focused on the protection of refugees, and IOM focused on their movements. When we began, we started with 16 different member states, and now we have 173 countries that are members. We joined the UN in 2016. And so the slide everyone should see is a bit of the progression of now IOM as it started back in 51, primarily to help move refugees out of Europe, to 2016, where our then Director General and the then Secretary General signed the agreements for IOM to join the UN. IOM is one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world. In 2018, our programming reached approximately 30 million people with life-saving assistance. I've had the experience of working in many of these countries, seeing the horrific circumstances that migrants and displaced people and refugees are going through is they're trying to find a better situation for themselves and their families. We're the largest provider of direct assistance to victims of traffickings, with over 100,000 victims directly receiving assistance as they try to restart their lives and move out of trafficking rings into reintegration and into their future. We handle the health assessments and movements associated with the resettlement of approximately 100,000 refugees a year globally. You may remember, probably from the pre-COVID era, going through different airports and seeing groups of people with their white plastic bags and the IOM logo on the side. Those were refugees that were starting their lives in a new country. And it's something that's been, resettlement's been horrifically affected by COVID. We're also the second largest provider of emergency shelter assistance in the humanitarian community, and we manage camps for people fleeing conflict and natural disasters throughout the world. Lastly, in addition to providing life-saving humanitarian assistance, we spend a lot of time looking at root causes. We work with the migrants themselves, civil society, governments, and the private sector to look at the root causes of displacement. If you dig deep enough into a conflict, somewhere you're going to find an issue with land rights. Somewhere you're going to find an issue with distribution of water. And until we work not just at the consequences, but at the root causes of displacement, we're very challenged to be able to resolve this. And we do this in quite a bit of other programming through our offices in over 100 countries in the world. And thanks again for the opportunity to discuss it. My next slide, I'm just going to leave and allow everyone a minute to read through. And I would ask you to remember that last bullet point on this slide, because I'm going to take down the slide deck so we can go back to a conversation. So now I'm going to close that slide deck. The last bullet point was about upholding the dignity of all migrants. And that's regardless of their age, their gender, religion, sexual orientation, wealth, or status. This event has a focus on national security. And in order to understand the nexus between security, governance, and migration, we need to begin by understanding what human security means in the broadest sense. I don't believe that human security and national security are at odds with each other. A secure society is grounded in respect for the rights of everyone, including migrants. Allow me to give a real practical answer in today's environment. If access to healthcare is predicated on immigration status, those without the right status will not access the healthcare. The consequences of this in a pandemic are very significant. You don't want sick people in the shadows of society. Migration is an eminently political issue. In the past decade, the politicization of migration has been evidenced by a series of developments. The fear in Western countries of an influx of masses of migrants, renewed outbreaks of xenophobia in Western countries of an influx that blames the domestic crises on migrants, the exploitation of migration issues to gain electoral mileage. All of these examples illustrate the close links between the economic, political, and social issues on the one hand, and mobility on the other. More than ever before, migration is a ready target with psychological, economic, and public relations connotations. So now we're going to move to our next poll. When was the paragraph I just spoke written? Was it created for this event? created earlier, and you have a few different choices. And while everyone is filling that out, let's think. It makes sense that international migration is a hugely sensitive issue. What is more core to the concept of sovereignty than controlling who enters and exits your territory? I am clearly speaking to a very informed audience. Well over half, 66%, said that that paragraph was created before 2005. And that is correct. You can find it in the 2002 World Migration Report which comes out every year or two from IOM. International migration touches at the core of sovereignty. And this is emphasized in Article 1 of the Constitution of my organization, IOM, created back in 1951. And I quote, "Control of standards of admission and the number of immigrants to be admitted are matters within the domestic jurisdiction of states. And in carrying out its functions, the it being IOM, shall conform to the laws, regulations, and policies of the state." This creates a very clear line between the role of global institutions and national governance. Mobility is a timeless action, just as the politicization of migration is a timeless issue. While the context changes based upon location and era, what drives migration remains fairly constant. One driver is the fear of persecution. Almost every person in this audience who grew up in the US read in her or his textbook about the pilgrims fleeing religious persecution. This is baked into the US national memory. Now, a well-founded fear of persecution is also reflected within the 1951 Convention on Refugees and the 1967 Protocol, providing a framework for protection for the 26 million refugees we have today. And I'm glad that we have Jeff Crisp on an upcoming panel, an expert on this and other migration-related issues to discuss further. Another driver for migration is a lack of access to livelihoods and a desire to create a better life for oneself. You know, our reckoning with racism in the United States makes us much more aware that for millions of Americans whose descendants were brought here as slaves, their migration story had nothing to do with seeking opportunity. For others with a different lived experience, such as my family, we came to the US 2 generations back, going through Ellis Island, poor but free, and seeking opportunity for better life. That's mirrored all throughout the globe. There's a need and a desire to financially support those who remain at home. 34% of Haiti's gross domestic product is from the remittance flows. That's money of migrants and others going back to Haiti. Over a third of the GDP. 30% of Nepal, 21% of Honduras, 20% of El Salvador. 20%, think about that. If you combined the financial, the real estate, and the insurance industry together in the United States, you get to about 20%. Think of how foundational that is in our economy. And then think of how that translates back into the economies where it has that equivalent level through remittances. There's a desire to join families that had previously migrated. Climate change is also increasingly becoming a driver. For the students in the audience, environmental induced displacement and migration is not studied well enough. It's not understood well enough. And this is coming from an organization that's been looking at it since the 1990s. If you're interested in that topic, let's continue this conversation sometime in the future. More and more, we're facing what we call mixed flows of people, complex population movements involving refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, victims of trafficking, smuggled migrants, unaccompanied minors, and others. It's complicated. I'll give a couple examples. After Gaddafi was killed in Libya in 2011, there were a lot of labor migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and from South Asia that had been working in Libya. And now they were incredibly scared and many were leaving. At the same time, Libyans, having a well-founded fear of persecution, were crossing the border. It was these mixed flows that had IOM and the UN Refugee Agency work together and have a joint operations center to deal with these mobile populations. Fast forward to Venezuela, with over 5 million refugees and migrants that have gone outside their border. In this instance, the UN Secretary General had asked IOM and UNHCR to jointly coordinate the assistance for Venezuelans that were outside of Venezuela. So many categories. Let me just share some figures. We have 272 international migrants in the world. It's an increase of about 20% in the last 10 years. Based upon population size, if all the international migrants were together, they'd be the 4th largest country in the world, behind the US and above Indonesia. Huge, huge numbers. Maybe 50 million or so, we don't know, of these international migrants are irregular migrants. What that means is that he or she may have entered a country with false documents or not crossing at a formal border crossing. Alternatively, he or she may have entered the country with the right documents, but their status changed inside the country. Imagine an individual goes to a country and they go with a single entry visa for a job, and they arrive and they're in regular status. A family member has died at home and they go home for the funeral. They don't have a new visa to get back, but they still have a job there. So maybe they take a tourist visa. They get back and they continue to work. They've shifted from regular to irregular. Another example is if they go to a country and are tied to the work of an employer. They have a better opportunity or there's difficult things that are with that employer. When they move from one job to another, their status is removed. They go from a regular status to an irregular status. But let's talk about conflict. By the end of 2019, over almost 80 million individuals were forcibly displaced because of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. That includes the 26 million refugees in the world, the highest ever seen. And we're talking about the US, Australia, and Europe and policy a bit more today, but we need to remember that the #1 refugee hosting country in the world is Turkey with 3.6 million. Colombia is second. Pakistan and Uganda are third and fourth. We also have 45 million internally displaced people and over 4 million asylum seekers. COVID-19 has raised the visibility of another category of concern, stranded migrants. And IOM estimates that there are about 2.75 million stranded migrants in the world today. What I'm going to do is go back to the screen and show one more slide. I want everyone to watch this slide change colors, and then we're going to have another poll. You'll see that we're looking at the number of restrictions that have been put in place by countries as they deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're starting on March 10th. As COVID spread across the world, mobility restrictions also spread across the world.
Brian, there's no slide showing.
No slide showing?
No slide showing.
Well, then we will We will skip that part. Let me get out of that. What we have is we had over 90,000 mobility restrictions, which were put into place in order to help spread or help stop the spread of COVID. Over 90,000. Just think about that. But let's personalize it. Imagine navigating through these restrictions, but you don't get to keep your wallet. Remove that. Replace it with debt. You don't get a passport. Replace it with isolation. You don't get being treated with dignity. Just replace it with a certainty of extortion, possibly without an embassy to call. Now, of course, that's not the experience of all or even many, but it's the experience of quite a few. And it's an experience that is so daunting and is so horrifying when we think about navigating our travel schedules in the era of COVID. We have to imagine the travel of the most vulnerable. You know, some countries have been quite proactive in addressing vulnerability issues, allowing migrants, regardless of their status, to have access to medical facilities, access to food. I already mentioned how important it is for people to have access to medical facilities during a pandemic. You know, significant support's required to ensure the right systems are in place throughout the world. And for example, the US has contributed $860 million to the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan, an amount 3 times higher than the next contributor. So thank you for the support from the US. Canada, Portugal, Italy, and Germany, and many other states have addressed the visa requirements arrangements for seasonal workers. The government of Qatar has announced that migrant workers undergoing quarantine or medical assistance will continue to receive their salary. The Slovak Republic has extended residency permissions for non-citizens. In recent weeks, about 3,400 Mozambican minors have gone through COVID-19 testing, gone through awareness raising, and will likely be returning to South Africa to continue their livelihoods. For IOM, one of the many things we're involved in is putting together a translation app, which we've given to border officials throughout the world in about 50 different languages focused on health issues so that border officials can more easily engage migrants. We're concerned that if it becomes harder for migrants to use regular migration, they may turn to traffickers and irregular migration patterns. Not only does that increase the likelihood of exploitation of migrants, it also enriches transnational criminal networks that profit off the smuggling and trafficking of humans. Now, I'm so pleased to know that COVID-19 and the issue of mobility is going to be touched on by one of the panelists, Kathleen Newland, who recently published a really excellent paper on this topic. So I'll stop there. But one final comment on stranded migrants. Unfortunately, the issue of stigmatization, marginalization, helplessness, and xenophobia doesn't actually end when the migrants get home. At their place of origin in the era of COVID, the returning migrants are that foreign thing. In one of the multiple books written by panelist Professor Lee is on the topic of xenophobia, an issue faced by migrants at their destination, while in transit, and even back home. The second panel is focused on what's coming next regarding US immigration policy. I'm not going to try to predict. I'll leave that to the experts, but I can speak a bit about what currently exists. And so now we'll go to our third poll, which is prior to today, how many of you have ever heard of the Migrant Protection Protocol Agreement, which is an agreement I will be speaking briefly about. And I'll start by quoting the Department of Homeland Security website. The MPP is a government action whereby certain foreign individuals entering or seeking admission to the US from Mexico, illegally or without proper documentation, may be returned to Mexico and wait outside of the US for the duration of their immigration proceedings, where Mexico will provide them with all appropriate humanitarian protections for the duration of the stay. Well, again, I think we speak to the intelligence and knowledge of the crowd that over a third are aware. Because now we're dealing with some very, very specific and technical issues relating to migration policy. The movements heading to the southern border of the US are largely from Central America, although significant numbers are also from Africa and elsewhere. Multiple reasons are given for migrating: violence, retribution, lack of rule of law, degraded environment, poverty. Again, think mixed flows. And since the US government enacted the MPP in January of 2019, there's approximately 70,000 people have returned to Mexico to await their US asylum hearing. When they return by the government of Mexico, they're given temporary migratory status, allows them to work, open bank accounts, access services. However, the documentation they receive, it's not universally accepted. And it's a challenge for the migrants to be able to access these different resources, the banks, the government services, and the employers. Of the 70,000, about 24,000 cases are pending. And since the end of March, MPP hearings have been suspended due to the pandemic. You know, the number of the people who have applied for the MPP and are awaiting and staying in shelters, that number is actually going down. Why is that? We're not 100% sure, but we think there's a couple different reasons. One, there's a growing frustration as they wait for their hearing, again, which has been suspended due to COVID. And secondly, Mexico is increasingly being looked at as a country where it could be a final destination. So with support from the government of Mexico and the government of the United States, IOM Mexico has been providing humanitarian assistance within 70 shelters along the northern border of Mexico. We're providing assisted voluntary return for about 1,500 people who applied for MPP so far who choose to return home rather than stay in Mexico. And for those who wish to stay in Mexico, we provide cash-based assistance and support for rent. Another important policy is the US-Guatemala asylum agreement called the ACA, the Asylum Cooperative Agreement. In the interest of time, I won't go into the ACA other than to say it's predicated on the idea that asylum seekers do not need to be in or reach the US to access protection. ACA, like MPP, has had its critics, and the panel, I'm sure, is going to discuss this in greater detail. We're going to cross the Atlantic, and I am going to try and see how I can do with technology again. And ask everyone to take a look at this map. And Anne, if I could ask, are you seeing the map? Yes?
Yes, we see the map.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Let's begin in East Africa. You can see Djibouti. You can see the path going from Djibouti into Yemen. For the second year in a row, Yemen's the top humanitarian crisis in the world, with 80% of the population needing assistance. We're providing shelter, water, health, and other life-saving assistance, as well as many other UN and international NGO and local NGOs. Yet during this massive conflict, even in the last quarter of the year, 1,500 Ethiopians and Somalis transited through Yemen to try to become an irregular migrant in Saudi Arabia. On this trek, they faced sexual and gender-based violence, torture, abduction for ransom, forced labor, physical violence. And if everything works out, they'll be an irregular migrant. Think of the desperation and despair that drives that decision-making. It's not a lack of awareness. It's understanding the horrific environment someone's about to enter, and then, in agreement with the family, deciding to still do it. That's what people are facing. Let's move from the east to the west. I've worked in a lot of humanitarian crises, conflicts, and natural disasters. And if you can see in Niger, a city that has a lot of lines because it's a big transit hub going through it, you'll see the city of Agadez. And some of the stories that I heard from returning migrants in Agadez, some of the most heartbreaking of my career. Because north of Agadez, north of Niger is Libya, and that's a transit route to Europe, and the transit routes go through Tripoli. There's over 2,400 migrants in 8 official detention centers in Libya. There's countless more in unofficial centers run by different factions. Let me tell one story. I remember a young man from Burkina Faso who told me the story when he was in Agadez. He had gone through Agadez earlier, transiting up through Libya, and by the time he had even reached the southern border of Libya, he had been extorted 5 separate times in order to get money at different formal and informal crossings. He doesn't pull out an ATM card. He doesn't do a Venmo. What happens? You end up reaching back to your family, the family that's already assumed debt to facilitate your travel, to access more resources, because they see their livelihood at home connected to your successful journey. So he pays and he moves, he crosses the border into Libya. He gets detained. He gets asked for money. He gets beaten. He gets more money. He makes it up to Libya or to Tripoli. He gets detained. He's starved. He's beaten. He's treated horrifically. I can remember the face like it was yesterday. This individual looking at me, describing one of the best days of his life when he was in jail is when he was sold from one detainment center commander to another, because this new leader was from West Africa and he thought maybe there'd be more value found in his life. He was put on the daily labor market to generate money. Eventually, he was so weak, he was just let go. They couldn't extract any more from him. And he made the decision not to even try to get to Europe, but to try to get home, crossing into Algeria, coming all the way south. 3 years later, coming back to IOM, or coming back to northern Niger, picked up by an IOM mobile unit, given medical attention, psychosocial counseling, food, and other assistance as he returned, as he planned to return home. And IOM supports people returning home. I remember IOM working in Libya with the government of Bangladesh to return Bangladeshi workers who were in the oil refineries in Libya when the chaos started and had nowhere to go. Prior to the first Gulf War, IOM helped thousands of Filipinos return from Iraq. Returns is a very complicated issue. It's complicated for the migrants and individuals themselves. It's complicated for the communities of return. And for those who make it to Europe, things remain difficult. You've probably read the news, what's going on in Bosnia, what's happened at the Moria camp in Lesbos in Greece. While we're not working on the Greek islands, we're assisting in moving unaccompanied minors off those islands. There's an agreement between the EU and Turkey about the handling of refugees in Turkey, and that results in Turkey having the largest number of refugees in the world. There's a European Commission new pact on migration and asylum that just came out last month. It still needs to be discussed and approved by the Parliament and the EU Council. But I think the refugee crisis of 2015 and 2016 revealed major shortcomings in the complexity of managing migration for Europe. I try to mention these figures to you, but what we try to do is we also try to capture them in the Missing Migrants project. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen and move back. Data is hugely important to make informed decisions. In the Missing Migrants project, which you're all free to look at, it's documented over 30,000 women, men, and children who've lost their lives trying to reach other countries. The Mediterranean Sea has seen the largest amounts, over 18,000 people, over 1,800 deaths since 2014 along the US-Mexican border. Data is hugely important to make informed decisions. It informs policymaking and it informs advocacy. Let's move east. Moving past Iraq and Syria, we see many more Iranians, Afghans, Pakistanis on the move. Again, you need to think mixed flows. Many of them not heading to Europe or heading to Australia. Between 2002 and 2008, the government of Australia had about 450 asylum seekers arrive by boat, less than 100 a year. They had put in place a boat turnback policy the year before. In 2012 and 2013, that number had increased to 38,000 asylum seekers, and the boat turnback policy came back. Australia has also created agreements with the island state of Nauru, Cambodia, PNG, tied with offshore processing of asylum claims, and I'm sure this will be discussed in greater detail by the panel. We provide humanitarian assistance to stranded migrants in the countries neighboring Australia, as well as returns assistance for those whose asylum claims have not been approved. On a regional level, we're supporting the Bali process, co-led between the governments of Indonesia and Australia, focused on people smuggling, trafficking in persons, and related transnational crime. And just like elsewhere in the world, the issue of mobility and asylum and international migration is very complex. To conclude, it's important to understand migration and development and how they're changing globally, given their relevance to states, local communities, and individuals. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has a specific goal to, quote, facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. Human migration is an age-old phenomenon. It stretches back to the earliest periods of history. Its manifestations and impacts have changed over time as the world has become more globalized. Now more than any other time in history, we have more families uprooted than ever before, but also more data to inform advocacy and policy. And lastly, the concept of control of migration needs to be considered, not purely as an approach to prevent movement, but as a way to minimize the dangerous means of travel, often in the hands of those who seek to exploit migrants. In this frame, the development of legal channels of migration, a better understanding of the circular nature of international migration, the establishment of ethical recruitment policies, strengthening of reintegration programming and economic development opportunities for migrants can all be investments in stronger, more secure migration systems, reducing the financial rewards for criminal smuggling and human trafficking networks. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this keynote. I look forward to your questions and for the upcoming panels. Thank you very much.
Brian, on behalf of everyone who's been listening to you, I want to thank you quite sincerely. You make a fabulous representative of the IOM, and I'm very impressed by the breadth of issues you've been able to cover in this keynote. Before going further, let me remind attendees that you can ask questions of Brian Kelly if you go to the Q&A function of Zoom. You should find it at the bottom of your screen, And if it's not there, check the top of your screen. But yeah, there is a Q&A function, and Professor LeBlanc will be sorting through your questions and teeing them up to ask Brian Kelly in just a few minutes. I want to start off the Q&A by asking Brian a few questions myself. And Brian, this is the reward you get for making such a broad and interesting talk, is that now you have to answer. You get peppered with Q&A. So there's no rest for you just yet. So one of my first questions has to do with IOM having to pull off a tricky balancing act between providing services and respecting the rights and the dignity of migrants, but at the same time, having major governments pay its bills, and having the US and European governments and Australia be members of the IOM and chip in to cover the costs of IOM operations and to contract with IOM for certain operations. So I'm curious in two ways. One is you've been in IOM for some time. You've seen how this works in the field. How do the rank and file staff of IOM, how does this tricky balancing act affect their daily work? You know, do you all ever talk about this? Is this something that is on your minds? And then secondly, and importantly, how does the leadership, the Director General of IOM, in the time that you've been at IOM, how do you see how the Director General handles this tricky balancing act of having the support of major governments, but at the same time, keeping an eye on the dignity of the migrants?
Thank you, Anne. Really important questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. IOM, we don't have a printing press. There's no IOM currency. That wallet I showed earlier, it's got dollars in it. There is no IOM script. It's an issue, not simply for IOM, but for the entire United Nations, which also doesn't have its own currency. It needs to work largely through the resourcing and financing of its member states. And member states have their priorities, and they're going to shape their foreign assistance through those priorities. And what we try to do is, an organization that doesn't represent one member state, but represents 176. I may get that number wrong, but I think that's where we are right now. What we try to do is assume that convening role. For example, between labor sending and labor receiving countries. Labor receiving countries can enjoy getting their assistance through bilateral agreements, have a very wealthy country sitting on this side of the table and a much less developed country with not as many resources on the other. That does not necessarily create a fair agreement with the interests of migrants at heart. So we try to bring together groups of different parties representing different perspectives to come to common agreements on minimum standards and approaches. And I think that our Director Generals and our current Director General, Vitorino, really sees the importance of data and knowledge and information in pursuing this. He communicates on such a regular basis about the importance to ensure the dignity of migrants, to ensure the respect for the rights of migrants. Now, how do you measure dignity? What are the different tools at hand? How do we put that together? And so once we have consensus from our member states about ensuring the dignity for migrants, which we do, we then work to define exactly what that means and then hold countries accountable. Ultimately, the decision as to who's going to enter or exit your state is a sovereign decision, and it's going to be made on the state level, not on the multilateral level. But we can get agreement on terms and categories. Some where we've had success and some where we're still working. As you know well, Ann, there's still no universally accepted definition for the word migrant. And we try to pull people together in countries together to have a common understanding.
Thank you. There's another tricky balance as you look around the world, which is within governments, who's in charge of these issues? And it requires, as I know from working inside the US government, an interagency approach. But we see that when one looks at providing services to migrants, you're talking, if it's overseas, you're talking to humanitarians. If it's in domestic audience inside the US, for example, it is social welfare organization, immigrants' rights organizations, churches, so the social welfare world. But the other group that's intensely interested comes from law enforcement, from border security and border control. Do you think that this conversation across governments is also striking the right balance? Or have we gone too far? And I guess my own views are now sneaking out. Have we gone too far to putting the border control experts in the driver's seat to the detriment of people who care for refugees and migrants and also and asylum seekers and care for the rights of those people?
Well, let me speak a bit more generally. In that, as I said in my remarks earlier, I just don't think that we need to make a choice between human security and national security issues. I recognize that that is not an opinion fully embraced by all of the various parts of whether or not it's the US government or virtually any government that exists. But we can try to demonstrate how one really complements the other. The pandemic is just such an excellent example of this, the horror of it. When people are in the shadows, that's not helping the broader community. And if that person who's not accessing health is a regular migrant, irregular migrant, whatever their status is, a citizen without insurance, whatever that status is, they put at risk the broader community. And so there really has to be a way to bridge that gap. There's a lot of look at the externalization of borders, the really looking at purely a national security lens. But I think it does a disservice to the individuals and also the communities and citizens that government represents. Because there's risks with ignoring populations. And I just think that we need to figure out ways to understand the complementarity between human security and national security rather than look at it as an either or.
Thank you. David, can you take over at this point and take over the peppering so that we can gang up on Brian Kelly?
Happily, and I'm cognizant of time, so we only have a few minutes for some pretty quick Q&A. Let me remind those of you who have asked questions in the box that a number of the themes that you're asking Mr. Kelly about are things that will certainly be addressed in the next panel, if not the next two panels. So let me ask two questions, Brian. The first is, Kevin Cole asks a question about the effect that the COVID pandemic has on resettlement programs around the globe and the extent to which it has really impacted the ability of IOM and other aid agencies to provide aid to displaced populations. The question here is, to what extent is aid flowing to, whether we're talking about material aid or human aid in terms of aid workers, able to get to areas that are the most vulnerable? How has the aid community been able to work during COVID?
It's just been incredibly challenging. I will make sure that my slide deck makes it to the Miller Center and hopefully then to everyone, because I'd like them to look at that slide that didn't pop up, which shows the 90,000 mobility restrictions that have covered the earth. So one's simply like just a compliance with law issue. Flights have been shut down. People aren't going from A to B. There's quarantines involved in going from A to B, and quite often to get to B, there's A.5 in the middle because there's not direct flights from every location. So imagine a location to a quarantine transit to a quarantine transit to a final destination. There's cost implications to that as well, significant cost implications. And so it's had a huge impact on refugee resettlement figures and overall global mobility as it's had on the mobility of, I'm sure, many members of our audience. For the delivery of life-saving assistance, it's also proven incredibly challenging. You have the issue of being able to access PPE. You have the ability of the supply chains that you utilize to get life-saving assistance has crumbled. Just imagine, in the US, it's toilet paper. Globally, it's shelter-grade plastic sheeting. I mean, the impact on supply chains for all of these different things is incredibly significant. And we have to keep our staff safe. We have to keep our partners safe as well. And so doing it in a thoughtful way while making sure that we get assistance to others. There is, I think, one silver lining in this dark cloud is that I'm glad to say that about 98% of IOM's workforce is all national staff of the various countries where we work. And this has really forced us to focus on building the capacity of the communities where conflict is occurring, where displacement is located, where people have arrived, to really help people who are in that area have the ability to help others and help themselves. It's always been important to IOM, but it's pushed it front and center about building the capacity on the national level. Short answer, huge challenge, huge problem, and we're trying our best.
All right, let me hit you with another hopefully quick question with a hopefully quick answer, which is what really strikes me is the lack of spread of COVID in refugee camps. I look every day, and when COVID began, that was my biggest fear as somebody who works in this space. Do you have any insight or thoughts as to why why we haven't seen spread? Do you attribute it to lack of testing and reporting, or do you have a hunch that it's the ability to isolate folks who and really control who's able to enter and leave a lot of these camps?
Yes.
Awesome.
It really is that for a lot of these people, they are in controlled environments, You just don't have the same levels of flow. There's no idea of I'm going to go to the next town to go see my cousins and have a nice Sunday barbecue and return home. It's just not that world, as I know you know well. And secondly, the wealthier countries of the world have assumed a massive significance of the supply chain of testing kits and various other things that would be required to even have a complete understanding of exactly where we are. It is an issue. We've certainly had cases, and it's something that we're tracking quite closely. Our medical health teams are, but I don't think that we have a good understanding of the scale of it. And I would also agree that as a whole, these groups have not been as affected as we hope does not happen in the future.
Well, on that, there are a variety of other questions that are in the box, and I hope that we'll be able to address some of those in the course of the next two panels. Brian, thank you very much for your comments and for sticking around to answer some questions. I'm going to pitch it back over to Anne, who is going to moderate our first panel. So thanks again, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We really appreciate the way you've teed up these issues perfectly for our marvelous panel that we have joining us from several continents and the West Coast. And so what I will do is introduce all four panelists right now, and then we will proceed to hear from them. Jeff Crisp is going to lead off, and Jeff is a specialist on refugee migration and humanitarian issues. He has held senior positions with the UN Refugee Agency, where he was head of policy development and evaluation, as well as the Global Commission on International Migration, the Independent Commission on International Humanitarian Issues, Refugees International, and the British Refugee Council. He has a lot of firsthand experience of refugee situations throughout the world and has published, lectured, and broadcast extensively on refugee-related issues. He's currently affiliated with the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford and Chatham House in London. We've asked Jeff to talk about Europe and the Mediterranean, a very important hotspot for these issues. Secondly, we'll hear from Regina Jeffries, who's awake in the middle of the night in Australia. And Regina is a teaching fellow and Scientia PhD scholar at the University of New South Wales. She is also a consultant for the Caldor Center for International Refugee Law and an expert on US immigration and refugee law with more than a decade of experience practicing asylum and refugee law in the United States. Her work traditionally has focused on street-level bureaucrats, technology, and legal compliance in international refugee law, but through her research, she has gained a highly detailed understanding of Australian asylum policy. And so we feel quite fortunate to have an American voice describing for us what's going on in Australia. Third, we'll hear from Professor David Fitzgerald. He is the chair in US-Mexican relations, a professor of sociology, and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. His research analyzes policies regulating migration and refugees in countries of origin, transit, and destination, as well as the experiences of people on the move. Notably, Professor Fitzgerald brought out a book in 2019 that is entitled Refuge Beyond Reach: How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers. This was winner of the American Sociological Association International Migration Section Best Book Award. And also David LeBlanc will tell you it was the inspiration in many ways for this Battle Symposium topic that we have this year. He's currently working on a book titled Refugees, a Sociological Systems Approach. And as the third speaker in our panel, he'll bring us back to North America and ground some of the discussion about practices happening overseas in US practices dating back to earlier Democratic and Republican administrations. Last but certainly not least is Kathleen Newland, a friend of mine for over a quarter of a century, and a senior fellow and co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute. Her work focuses on the governance of international migration, the relationship between migration development and refugee protection. Prior to MPI's establishment in July 2001, Kathleen co-directed the International Migration Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. She has worked as a consultant to many international organizations, notably the UN Refugee Agency, IOM, and the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. She's a member of the board of Kids in Need of Defense, a nonprofit organization that provides pro bono legal services to unaccompanied children caught up in the U.S. immigration system, certainly a hot issue right now. And she's also a former chair of the Women's Refugee Commission. She has written a great deal. And most recently, as Brian Kelly mentioned, she's written on COVID and displacement. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that from Kathleen. So enough hearing from me. Let's turn it over to Jeff Crisp joining us this morning. We're all very eager to hear from you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Anne, for giving me the floor, and greetings to everybody from Oxford. I see there's more than 150 people online, so great to have so many people attending this very important conference. What I'd like to do in the next 6 or 7 minutes is to provide a brief but critical analysis of state responses to the refugee asylum issue in Europe and the Mediterranean region over the past 5 years. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to 5 key characteristics of EU policy and practice during that 5-year period. First, I'd like to point out a serious lack of preparedness and planning on the part of the European Union and its member states. Despite the massive material and intelligence resources at its disposal, the EU seemed to have been caught completely unaware by the large-scale arrival of refugees and asylum seekers into the continent in 2015 and 2016. And I would argue that it's been playing catch-up ever since that time. And while the refugee emergency in Europe is well and truly over in terms of numbers, the European Union continues to act as it still has a crisis on its hands. Second characteristic, I would point to the growing externalization of refugee and asylum policies. In other words, shifting responsibility for migration control to states outside Europe. And this is a trend epitomized most clearly by the deals that the European Union and its member states have done with countries such as Turkey, Libya, Niger, and Sudan. Deals, all of which are designed specifically to exclude refugees and asylum seekers from the European Union. A third trend of the past 5 years I'd like to point out is that of the growing criminalization of asylum, as seen and demonstrated by the growing numbers of European Union citizens that have been prosecuted for their role in aiding asylum seekers. At the same time, we've witnessed a systematic attempt to delegitimize and obstruct NGO search and rescue organizations that were operating in the Mediterranean Sea. And we've also seen at the same time the progressive withdrawal of European Union naval assets that might have contributed to the task of saving lives at sea. The fourth characteristic of EU refugee policy over the past 5 years has been a readiness to violate refugee rights and to challenge the principles of international refugee law. And Brian has already made reference to some of the examples I was going to give. To give just a few of these examples, I could mention the violence that's been inflicted upon asylum seekers in countries such as Croatia and Hungary, the awful conditions found in the Greek refugee camps, particularly that of Moria on the island of Lesbos that Brian mentioned earlier, and perhaps most egregiously of all, the EU role, very direct role, in supporting the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept refugees at sea and to return them to abusive and exploitative detention centres on land in Libya. Finally, I'd like to suggest that the last 5 years have seen a serious lack of solidarity within the EU itself. Frontline states such as Greece and Italy have been left to bear a disproportionate share of responsibility for refugee arrivals. Efforts to relocate refugees throughout the European Union have had generally disappointing results. And certain states, particularly those in the eastern part of the region, have fought hard against any attempt to develop a more cooperative and coordinated approach to the refugee issue. Now, to bring the story up to date, the most recent initiative, which is designed to try and establish a more coordinated and cooperative approach, is something that Brian also mentioned, which is the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which was published almost exactly 1 month ago. Now, I don't want to be entirely dismissive of that pact, as it contains some quite positive elements, such as, for example, a commitment to establish legal pathways for people who are in need of protection, and for the EU to support community-sponsored refugee resettlement programs. These are very positive developments that should be welcomed. In other respects, however, I'd like to argue that the pact has a number of quite important weaknesses and limitations. First, it's not really clear whether it does actually have the support of all EU member states. And again, those in the east of the region have already expressed some concerns and doubts about it. So is it really a pact if it doesn't have the agreement of all member states? Secondly, and very strangely to me at least, the pact hardly makes any reference to the global compacts on refugees and the global compact on migration, despite the enormous amount of time, effort, and resources that were poured into those two initiatives. Thirdly, if you look at the detail of the pact, it actually reinforces the EU's externalized agenda and denies asylum seekers access to EU territory on the basis of some very vague criteria. Fourth, the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum envisages a much more aggressive role for Frontex, the European Border Control Agency. It places an enormous amount of emphasis on the return of asylum seekers to their countries of origin, and even envisages that a state such as Hungary, which is extremely unwilling to admit any refugees, might in the future contribute to the implementation of the pact by organising and funding such deportations of asylum seekers. This, I would like to suggest, is a very dangerous new twist on the notions of solidarity and responsibility sharing on which the international refugee regime was established when it was founded 70 years ago. To end on a more positive note, what might a more constructive EU refugee policy look like? Here are a few suggestions. I think it would focus on the restoration of search and rescue efforts in the Mediterranean and entail the establishment of more predictable disembarkation and refugee distribution mechanisms. It would entail the closure of Libya's awful detention centres and the improvement of conditions for refugees who find themselves in Europe's frontline states. It would involve the establishment of fast and fair refugee status determination procedures, with effective solutions being on hand for asylum seekers, whether or not they are found in that process to be refugees. And I think a more constructive approach on the part of the EU would involve the redeployment of the resources which are currently being used for externalization and border control to initiatives designed to strengthen the asylum capacity of countries in the global south. Perhaps one of the things that we might discuss as we move into the Q&A later is to how we might convince the European Union to adopt such a constructive approach, particularly at the time of COVID-19, which has provided a very convenient alibi for states to close their borders to refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for a very crisp and to the point intervention that is a model for all of us involved in the panel. So we're now going to turn from talking about Europe to talking about Australia. And don't let that blue sky behind Regina fool you. She's talking to us at 2 in the morning from Sydney, where our friends at the Caldor Center are located. Regina?
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to you all for having me, and hi from Sydney. I was hoping the fact that this was a background, but thank you, Anne, for pointing that out. It is an honor to participate today. A lot has been written about how states use externalization measures as tools to prevent asylum seekers crossing territory, restricting access to circumvent or mitigate international legal obligations like non-refoulement to avoid restraints on sovereignty. I'd like to first trace the outlines of a few political and legal events that underpin Australia's current approach to asylum seekers. And then I'll take you through its current policies, which are largely aimed at creating legal restrictions, inhumane conditions, and bureaucratic complications that actually narrow the number of people able to access protection. So Australia is somewhat unique in that it takes either a boat or a plane to access the territory. And it's a geography that officials view as giving it a security advantage in controlling the movement of people in and out of the country. And in Australia, the current externalization framework is enabled by a view of the border as a continuum of both space and time. But the framework is also underpinned by a view of security as put by the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, which is the Australian equivalent of the Department of Homeland Security, as going beyond national security to a sense of surety that society has. Statement and his actions over the last 2 decades, you can see a shift from the paradigm of asylum seekers and migrants more broadly as sources of nation building potential to the paradigm of asylum seekers as risks to be repelled and held in a deconstructed state where everyone and everything within it is externally facing. And in that sense, the broad range of externalization measures that Australia has adopted to control not only who arrives, but the terms upon which they arrive are directed both to asylum seekers and to a domestic audience. The Australian migration framework is characterized by a high of executive discretion, a judiciary that has a fairly conservative approach to striking down government action. And since at least 2001, that action's been largely intent on shifting responsibility for refugee protection to others. And while common law and legislates protections, Australia doesn't have a bill of rights. So litigation takes quite a different form than what we might be used to seeing in the US. But since the Tampa incident in August of 2001, boat arrivals and asylum seeking more broadly have been increasingly viewed as a threat to national security. The Tampa was a Norwegian container ship that rescued 400 asylum seekers at sea, actually at the request of the Australian government. The government subsequently prevented the Tampa from disembarking the rescued people on Australian territory. And after a dramatic boarding of the ship by Australian Special Forces to prevent its landing at Christmas Island, which is actually part of Australia, the asylum seekers were transferred to Nauru and New Zealand. And in response to the Tampa and the subsequent events of September 11th, enacted legislation to retrospectively legalize the executive's action. And those laws became known as the Pacific Solution, which involved excising territory from Australia's migration zone, removing people who enter at an excise zone to a designated country processing, agreements with Nauru, New Guinea, and also boat interceptions and takebacks to Indonesia. And the Pacific Solution ran until about 2008 when Labor discontinued it. But a series of domestic and international events led to the introduction of processing in August of 2012. And Australia currently uses a combination of interdiction, transfer, offshore processing, containment in third countries, media campaign, universal visa system, mandatory detention of unlawful non-citizens, excision of territory, crackdowns on humanitarian actors, government secrecy provisions with stiff jail for disclosure, all of that to maintain a policy of deterring people from seeking and receiving asylum. In 2013, a conservative government came back into power and instituted the current military security operation that's called Operation Sovereign Borders. And OSB is premised on the idea that Australia is experiencing an ongoing border protection crisis that is a national emergency despite receiving exceptionally low numbers of asylum seekers. At its highest total, actually about 20,000 people to reach Australia by boat to seek asylum. And last year in 2019, around 70,000 people total applied for asylum in Australia. So even for a country of around 25, the numbers are relatively small. And secrecy is also paramount with Operation Sovereign Borders. So for operational security reasons, the government doesn't disclose information about on-water operations, even to Parliament. And though relatively little known about what happens on board, we do know in Navy vessels interdict boats and engage in turnbacks and takebacks. Turnbacks are apparently done without protection screening, and takebacks use a so-called enhanced screening process before returning the person back to a country, often Sri Lanka. Perhaps the most visible aspect of Australia's strategy is offshore processing. And offshore processing was created post-Tampa and has been implemented by both conservative and liberal small L governments. Australia currently has agreements with PNG to transfer all unauthorized boat arrivals to either Nauru or Manus Island in PNG until relatively recently, where they were held in mandatory indefinite detention. And that included children and other vulnerable people without exception. And since August of 2012, more than 4,000 people have been sent offshore in what has been a self-inflicted humanitarian disaster. And thanks to a variety of developments, including negotiation of a 2016 refugee transfer deal with the US that Anne had a part in, as of this month, there are now 145 people left on Nauru and 145 people left on PNG. Australia and the US have also actively learned another in the migration policy space. Australia designed its maritime interdiction and offshore processing system using US interdiction in the Caribbean and offshore processing in Guantanamo Bay as a template, and also with the advice of US policymakers responsible to the US system. And in the US and Europe, Australia has adopted carrier sanctions stations, airline liaison officers at airport, the ALOs, as they're called, aided by data-driven risk profiling, aggressively weed out potential asylum seekers before they're even allowed to board a plane. So when someone actually does arrive in an Australian airport and seek protection, their visa is actually canceled on the basis of asylum claimed. They're then detained and they're sometimes removed before they're allowed to apply for asylum. And the policy transfers, learning, and similarities seem not to be unidirectional. These adopted asylum cooperation, or ACAs that I mentioned earlier, that strongly resemble Australia's agreements with Nauru and PNG. The ACAs actually allow transfers of asylum seekers from US territory to countries that people never transited. And just like Secretary of State Pompeo expressed the Trump administration's interest in replicating Australia's universal visa system, which enables mandatory indefinite detention for any non-citizen without a valid visa. And recently it was reported that CBP is using hotels to detain unaccompanied migrant children in violation of the agreement. Detention resembles a use of alternative places of detention where asylum seekers, including children, may be held in hotels or another place that's been designated as a place of detention for hours or years. So in Australia, increasingly filtering asylum seeking through a national security frame, both conservative and liberal governments have succeeded in largely insulating harsh and broad executive actions from political and judicial challenge. And the Australian experience is really interesting and questions about the extent to which broad discretionary executive action on asylum without thought of lasting solutions can be taken in the US context. And it might also provide insight into where US policy could, but should not go.
Thank you very much, Regina, for that very interesting survey of what's happening in Australia and how it relates to what's happening in the US. Continuing with this discussion, let's turn now to Professor David Fitzgerald, and I believe he's joining us from San Diego. Welcome.
That's right. Thanks very much, Anne and David and the Miller Center, for convening us together to talk about these really important issues. The bottom line is that for the world's refugees, fewer than 1% are ever resettled to another country through any kind of formal resettlement program. And so for the rest of them, for the rest of the 99% of the world's refugees, if they are to reach a place of safety, they have to travel on their own. And we've been hearing now from Jeff and from Regina about the ways that rich democracies in the global north have been systematically putting barriers in the way of people who might have a strong case for asking for asylum. Were they able to reach a safe country to be able to make that claim? So what I would like to do is give a quick historical comparison, talk about some of the similarities and differences among the European Union, Australia, and the US, and then move us towards a deeper historical understanding of US policy in Mexico and Central America to kind of tee up the next panel. Now, the individual strategies that states have adopted to try to keep asylum seekers away, in some ways have a really long precedent. You can find most of these policies already being exercised by the liberal European countries, Latin American countries, the US and Canada, to bottle up European Jews fleeing fascism in the 1930s and the 1940s. So a lot of the techniques that we've already mentioned, such as maritime interceptions, bottling up refugees in island detention centers, sanctions on transport companies, cracking down on people smugglers and so forth, those all have long precedent to keep those Jewish refugees bottled up in Europe. But something is new under the sun. What we now have that's new is there is a truly global system that doesn't just target one particular group of people. It targets all asylum seekers and unwanted migrants more generally. It's a system also because the different pieces of these strategies work together with each other. So it only makes sense to intercept people at sea if they can then be taken to a place where they have fewer rights, say fewer rights to access a lawyer, fewer rights to access an appeals court if an asylum decision goes against them. And in every different strategy, you can see how a single piece doesn't work unless it works in conjunction with these other pieces. It's also a system because there's a circulation of ideas. We've already heard just now from Regina about the way that some of those ideas about controlling unwanted migrants work and are copied by governments, often in an iterative way, where one country will copy another country's policies, change the policy a little bit, and then that in return is used to legitimize usually more draconian policies and often the original policy innovator. The bottom line of all of these kinds of policy transfers is that there is a race to the bottom, and governments look to other governments doing harsh things to say, well, it's actually not so bad to do what we're doing because already these other liberal democracies are doing similar things. Let me talk a little bit about the way that this has worked concretely. So in the late 1970s, a number of countries in Southeast Asia, such as Malaysia, were pushing away boats full of Indo-Chinese asylum seekers leaving Vietnam and Cambodia. The US government called them out and said that this was a nefarious practice to take people who were fleeing from their lives and push them away from the coast without ever even hearing their asylum claim, often putting their lives into risk by pushing them away. If you just fast forward a few years, you see that by the early 1980s, the US Coast Guard had its own migrant interception program that it developed primarily to keep away Haitians and the Caribbean, later extended to try to keep away Cubans and other larger, other nationalities in smaller numbers. And in 1993, the US Supreme Court in the Sale decision legitimated Bush 1 administration policy of even refouling refugees, that is turning them back into the hands of the persecutors if they had been intercepted on the high seas. As we heard from Regina, Australian government in 2001 adopted elements of that US policy in the Caribbean, including the warehousing of intercepted asylum seekers and placing them in Guantanamo, where they had fewer access to lawyers and no access to appeals courts, and put their own policy into place that drew upon elements of that. Now, the European governments are often looking to the Australian model as a possible solution to their perceived problem. So this kind of circulation continues, and what seemed like a terrible practice, even in the eyes of a government, has quickly become normalized. Now, throughout these countries that we've been talking about, we see an intensification of different kinds of remote controls. And there are some differences among the different countries, but the general story is one of convergence. So if in the 1980s, these policies really became tightened in Europe, and certainly into the 90s with the strengthening of the EU institutions and Australia in the 2000s. By now, if you look around the world, it's a pretty similar set of policies in these rich democracies. Some of the differences have to do with visa policy, for example. So the European countries, the EU itself, Canada very explicitly target nationalities with high rates of asylum seeking when creating visa blacklists or putting other restrictions in place so that it's more difficult for people from countries with a lot of asylum seekers to be able to travel legally. Australians and the US don't do that as much, but the effect is the same because those same countries are already restricted under those US and Australian policies. So from the perspective of someone trying to reach a place of safety, the situation looks pretty similar. All of these countries deployed their navies and other maritime forces, sometimes at very great distances, thousands of kilometers from their borders in some cases, to try to intercept asylum seekers trying to arrive by sea. And Kathy Newland has an important report on this very issue. So this is something that Canada doesn't barely do at all. And that's really a feature of its remote geography, of the fact that it has this huge buffer in the form of the United States, rather than any special institutional features of Canada. The major idiosyncrasies in maritime control have to do with the way that people are processed and their rights are restricted if they are taken at sea. We've already heard what the Australian situation is. Many different European governments have tried to think about ways of doing their own forms of offshore processing in Eastern Europe or North Africa. These ideas have been floated since the late 1980s, but have never been concretized. The US has its system based in Guantanamo, not very active at the moment, but ready to go if a government should decide to use it, and has also used the Northern Mariana Islands for the same reason, where people have fewer rights if they are taken to those territories. You know, all of these countries are major contributors to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. They're major contributors to the IOM, as we heard from Brian Kelly's presentation. And these organizations have many different functions. One of their functions is humanitarian. They're providing care and assistance for people who are often in great distress. At the same time, they're also surveilling people. They are controlling people who might otherwise try to make their way to the global north. The IOM is involved in repatriation from buffer countries, for example, and also in creating publicity campaigns that try to deter irregular migrants. So these are kind of softer forms of border externalization, but they have the same general effect. All of the countries that we've been talking about tried to use their neighbors as buffer states. We've heard a bit about this from Regina Jeffries in terms of these asylum agreements that the US has with Central America and that Australia has with places like Papua New Guinea. And they don't just have, they don't just use diplomatic language. They don't just talk about putting pressure on buffer states. They're often sending equipment or training border and police forces, funding all kinds of computer equipment, databases, sometimes weapons, all kinds of material that can be used to make it much more difficult for migrants to be able to travel. Again, Canada stands out here because it already has this enormous buffer in the shape of the US, and so it doesn't need to do what these other governments have decided that they need to do. The safe third country designations have been a very common legal tool used in Europe. They've been used in Australia. Until recently, they have not been a big part of the North American scene, with the important exception of the US-Canada agreement. That's really something that we haven't seen until the Trump administration, to try to use those types of agreements more broadly. But let me say a few words about the historical precedents for what's going on with the Trump administration policy in Mexico vis-a-vis trying to control people coming from Central America and other countries, including outside of the continent. Since the 1980s, the US has been pressuring Mexico to make it much more difficult for people with particular nationalities to travel through the country, has in the 1980s funded refugee camps in southern Mexico, put pressure on Mexico to keep Central Americans within Mexico from ever reaching the northern border, to keep them bottled up in southern Mexico. By the 1990s, the US was quietly financing repatriations of third country nationals. In the 2000s, particularly after 9/11, there was a dramatic intensification in the securitization of these policies, with the US putting all kinds of pressure on Mexico to monitor people from mostly Muslim countries. The DHS has actually been conducting screenings of intending asylum seekers in the southern Mexico city of Tapachula. The Mexican government shares information on all arriving passengers by air in Mexico with US authorities before those passengers ever reach Mexico. So there's a lot of security cooperation behind the scenes, which is quite sensitive in Mexico. And then under the Trump administration, we've seen a number of different policies. I'll let the next panel talk about those in detail, but I will just highlight that the major difference is not just the types of policies, but the way that they are done, that they are very openly and aggressively using the fact that the US is a more powerful country to ram these policies through. If you look at the policy with Guatemala, for example, we see the US government openly threatening Guatemala with a ban on Guatemalan nationals, with putting tariffs on Guatemalan products, with taxing remittances of Guatemalan nationals in the US if they didn't fall into line. So this very brute exercise in raw power is something that really is different from the more subtle policies which had a similar aim for a much longer time. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And let me remind attendees, you can start to tee up your questions for this panel using the Q&A function. And also panelists, if you're interested in asking questions of each other, shoot me a chat alert to that. And now let's hear from Kathleen Newland of Migration Policy Institute.
Thank you very much. And my thanks to the Miller Center for allowing me to participate in this important conference, and particularly to my longtime friend and colleague, Ann Richard. As she mentioned, Ann and I go way back. I want to try to place today's issue in the context of the global pandemic, which has changed the landscape of international migration radically in a way that I can only compare to the changes after 9/11. As I'm sure you know, and have probably experienced directly, travel and migration have been permanently marked by 9/11. And I think it's likely that major changes resulting from the pandemic will also last for a long time. But I want to talk about the way this migration crisis differs from earlier ones. I want to talk about its consequences, especially its economic consequences, and what this means for international cooperation. My central point is this: the current toolbox for cooperation on international migration has very few instruments for dealing with the impact of a pandemic of the nature and reach of COVID-19. The post-World War II international agreements on migration are designed to help people on the move, whether voluntary or forced, as well as to promote cooperation among countries that are dealing with the consequences of this movement. So it's designed to deal with refugees, like those from Iraq or Afghanistan, or most dramatically in recent times from Syria. It's designed to deal to a lesser extent, but somewhat with mixed movements of refugees and migrants who are not refugees. But the major consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic is not movement, but the loss of movement. It's a crisis of immobility rather than mobility. And the dire economic consequences of the ability to move are beyond the frame of these existing international agreements. So let me talk about that for a few minutes. The loss of employment in the recession unleashed by the pandemic has been devastating to workers, their households, and national economies across the board. But migrants are among those most likely to have lost their jobs in the lockdowns and the business closures instituted to slow the spread of the virus. Immigrant women were especially hard hit. In April of this year, for example, they had the highest unemployment rate in the United States at 18%, which is up from 5% in January. Migrants are especially vulnerable to job loss because they're overrepresented among groups that have suffered the greatest increases in unemployment during the pandemic. Workers who are relatively young, workers who have relatively low levels of education, and workers who are working in the hard hit sectors of the economy, such as tourism, hospitality, retail business, transportation, and domestic work. For example, in June 2020, when the US unemployment rate overall was a little north of 8%, it was 28.5% for food servers and preparers, 21% for maids and housekeepers, and 20% for retail salespersons. And these are occupations in which migrants are highly overrepresented. Migrants' economic vulnerability is paired with vulnerability to contracting the virus. They're overrepresented in workplaces that put them on the front line of exposure, such as hospitals, nursing homes, meat packing, and other food processing facilities, and so forth. Migrants on temporary contracts, such as seasonal agricultural workers and construction workers, often live in crowded accommodations where social distancing is impossible. And all over the world, unauthorized migrants, likely to be working in the informal sectors of the economy, have been badly affected by the pandemic. In most countries where they're working, they have little or no access to safety nets, and many have had difficulties accessing consular services from their own countries, including repatriation flights, leading to the phenomenon that was mentioned in the keynote of stranded migrants, 2.75 million of them. The loss of work is ruinous, not just to migrants themselves, but also to their households and communities that are supported by the money that they send back home. An estimated 800 million people rely on remittances from migrants for all or most of their income. That's 1 out of 9 people on Earth. The World Bank projects a fall in remittances to low and middle income countries of 20% in 2020 compared to 2019, amounting to a loss of $109 billion. Although I must say, as in almost any crisis, migrants tend to reach deep into their pockets to try to keep up remittances, which is why remittance flows are more stable than many other financial flows. The loss of remittances around the world will not be evenly felt. Some 30 countries rely on remittances for 10% or more of their gross domestic product. 7 countries rely on remittances for more than a quarter of their GDP. And in the 3 most remittance dependent countries in the world, which are Tonga, Haiti, and South Sudan, remittances make up more than 1/3 of gross domestic product. The loss of remittance income will ricochet throughout migrants' home communities, where their families' abilities to purchase goods and services creates local employment and income for others. Some recent research in Bangladesh shows that households with a migrant earner, which before the pandemic were relatively better off than households without a migrant worker, are now among the worse off as remittance flows have ceased and returning migrants have not been able to find alternative employment. Migrants returning to their origin country also have brought back the virus. Guatemala suspended deportation flights from the US in April after health officials said that dozens of deportees had tested positive. Under pressure from the Trump administration, deportations resumed by June, although on a limited basis. There are still cases of people testing positive on those flights. More than 30,000 workers have returned to Ethiopia since March, some voluntarily after losing their jobs in the Gulf, and some through deportations. And at least 1,000, and probably many more, have returned carrying the virus. A group of scholars have constructed a sort of heat map of COVID-19 risk exposure, and it shows that a high correlation between the incidence of the virus in a migrant origin country and the incidence in the countries that have been the most common destinations of those migrants. The early responses to the pandemic had pretty much a singular focus on COVID-19 cases and deaths and on healthcare capacity and cost. Much less attention has gone to the human security consequences of the pandemic's fallout. That economic fallout may end up costing more lives than are taken by the virus directly. The bottom line here is that the restoration or replacement of remittance flows will be crucial for the economic recovery of countries of origin, particularly those highly dependent on remittances. The loss of foreign exchange from remittances will reduce those countries' ability to pay for critical imports, to service their debts. It may also lower their sovereign credit rating, which will force them to pay higher interest rates on their international borrowing. The International Monetary Fund has warned of potential debt crises as countries that rely on remittances for 5% or more of their GDP could experience persistent balance of payments problems beyond this year into the coming years. In recent years, some of the highest economic growth rates in the world have been in low and middle income countries, and migration is part of that success story. So we desperately need a framework for restoring international migration and mitigating its impact on economic development. Getting migrants back to their jobs abroad is critical to economic recovery, not just for their countries of origin, but for the world as a whole. But it's difficult to see that the major countries of destination are going to give priority to rehiring migrants when they're suffering from high unemployment rates and economic recession. Despite the pleas of corporations that their ability to hire foreign talent is essential to their competitiveness, governments will decide what gates to open on the basis of their own interests. For example, one of the first gates to open has been a limited opening for critical agricultural workers as harvest season came up in Europe. So the existing tools for responding to large-scale catastrophes, the most advanced being the Refugee Convention, but also some of the work plan of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the guiding principles on internal displacement, the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, which is designed to deal with natural disasters. These are designed to deal with events that force people to leave their homes, not the events that force them to return and thereby lose their livelihoods, or that foreclose an anticipated trip abroad for work, which they may already have paid for. But catastrophes that force people to leave or stay away from their places of work abroad or in another part of their own country can be just as effective in disrupting livelihoods and compromising health and safety as events that force people to leave their homes. But they're not covered by existing instruments. And we really need to be thinking about strengthening the international framework that will, in the first instance, protect people in this emergency phase from illness and death, that then will help them recover livelihoods in their countries of origin, and ultimately that will allow the reopening of pathways for legal migration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. Let me invite our panelists to unmute themselves. And a question that has come in from Jessica Jones, and I invite attendees to put their questions in the Q&A box, is whether there are any bright spots in terms of countries' responses. And this is a fair question given how grim and somber our presentations have unfortunately been accurate, but still a tough analysis of what's going on in the world right now. Do any of the panelists, can any of the panelists point to any bright spots? And she says, even if it's a country that's moving slower to adopt some of these restrictive measures, that could potentially be a bright spot. Kathleen, you have a bright spot?
Quickly, in the context of COVID, there are a number of countries that have moved to include migrants in their in the measures for detection of illness and treatment, and also inclusion of migrants in the social safety net. Ireland, for example, has made its basic minimum income during the pandemic available even to migrants who don't have legal status. And Spain and Portugal have extended visas of people who are sort of stuck in Spain or Portugal during the pandemic, whose visas were going to run out. So they've made it possible for people to retain legal status. A number of cities, New York, Los Angeles, Amman, Jordan, and several others have made treatment and prevention and safety measures accessible to migrants regardless of their immigration status.
So there's, some good examples. And it's interesting that some of them are from municipalities in addition to a handful of countries. Another question that was offered up earlier from Henk van Futum was in response to Brian Kelly's presentation, was asking about the language used in talking about migration. He asked, would it not be important to also have a reflection on the use of language flows as if migration is water, maps with big threatening invasion like arrows, and numbers where they are only counting irregular migrations, not regular migrations and emigrations, we tend to use to talk about migrants? I think this is a fair question. And I struggled, for example, in talking to the public about these issues to both use big scary numbers, but then I always wanted to try to put them into context in terms of how many people, for example, go through JFK Airport on any particular normal pre-COVID day. Any of the panelists want to take on this question about how we present this information, and could we do a better job educating the public? Go ahead, David.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, David.
Happy to talk about the refugee numbers. We often hear in the pages of the New York Times or from the UNHCR itself, from leading scholars often of refugee issues, that there are more refugees now than at any time in human history. It's simply not true. It's not true in absolute numbers. And if you look at the percentage of the world's population that's been displaced by war, it is much smaller now than it was after World War II. Almost 7% of the world's population was displaced after World War II. Most of them not in Europe. Everyone talks about European refugees. Most of the people displaced in World War II were displaced in Asia. And then they almost completely fall out of the discussion. So the world has experienced far larger flows of refugees before and come up with a system to deal with it. And we can understand why people from all different political persuasions might try to talk about how unprecedented a crisis is in order to get more resettlement slots or funding, or to scare people to think that if a few refugees are brought in, that will be the camel's nose in the tent. So people of all different political interests talk about this, but it's simply not the case.
Regina?
I was just going to give an example, an Australian recent example of this, in that one of here over the summer has been the number of people arriving by plane and requesting asylum. And out of, I think, a total of something like 46 visitors over the last, since 2012, there have been some minuscule amount of people who have ultimately applied for protection after arriving by plane. But it was something that the opposition party was using as a tool to attack the governing party on this issue of people arriving by plane in a safe way, and at some point after arrival seeking asylum. So I certainly see it in domestic political situations as well.
Jeff, did you want to add on?
Yeah, firstly, just to very much agree with David's point about the numbers. I've been quite critical of UNHCR on the way in which it uses numbers. It seems to base a lot of its public information material on the idea that, you know, if you talk about larger and larger numbers, you're going to get more and more public sympathy and support. And I'm not sure that's actually the case. We might actually be scaring people in the use of very large numbers. So if you look at the figure that UNHCR like to use, which is 79.5 million displaced people around the world, the largest number ever, according to UNHCR. If you start to break it down, you'll find that the number of refugees under UNHCR's mandate is actually only 20 million. And that if you look further into the figures, you'll find that 45 million of the 79 million are internally displaced people who have not actually left their own country. And we haven't even mentioned internally displaced people in the discussion so far. So I think we should be much more careful about the way we project the numbers. And similarly, in response to the earlier question, I think those of us who work in this area, we really have to kind of discipline ourselves not to use what I call aquatic metaphors, which is always talking about floods, flows, and deluges. And I know that even if we try to discipline ourselves, it's very easy to slip into that language. I think we do need to try and construct an alternative vocabulary because, as the questioner suggested, those words have very serious implications.
I want to call attention and give kudos to Jeff for his Twitter feed. And David Fitzgerald was the person who explained to me that if you want to stay abreast of what's going on in this area, it's very helpful to be on Twitter, something I wasn't really crazy about doing, to find out what experts in the field are sending out. And Jeff takes Twitter a few steps beyond just advertising the latest reports, and is able to share some viewpoints and interesting criticisms of the international community that responds to crises and migration situations. And so I recommend that to the attendees. We're coming up.
It's the advantage of not having a proper job, Anne.
We're coming up to noon, so we're going to have to wrap up this panel. My great thanks to the panelists. This only scratches the surface of these really interesting issues, and unfortunately, this very challenging time as we those of us who care about refugees and migrants are watching how they're not really the post-World War II agreements are not really being honored as we look around the world at these tough situations. So we're going to shift now to our to a different, much better moderator, Professor LeBlanc, a different panel. But before doing so, I just want to give my deep thanks to our wonderful panelists on this first panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for thank you, panelists. I think that first panel did a really wonderful job of setting the stage in helping us think about U.S. policy. What we want to do in this panel is use the setting of global responses or comparative responses to the refugee crisis, to immigration, to help us think about U.S. policy in both the current and in a historical perspective. And so in order to do that, we've assembled three panelists that I'm just so excited to be in conversation with. Erica Lee is a Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies and Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She has written 4 books, most recently, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. Doris Meisner was former commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Services, INS, back when there was an INS. She's a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she directs the Institute's U.S. immigration policy work. And Dara Lind, who covers immigration policy for ProPublica in Washington, D.C. To add on to what Anne said a moment ago about Twitter, I started following Dara when I got on Twitter, and she is a voracious tweeter, not just about immigration, but about the Washington Nationals, and to a lesser extent about her cats. The fact that she was willing to join us on this panel is a testament to her interest in migration, because I told her that I'm both a New York Mets and a dog person. So I was just delighted that she accepted our invitation. Anyway, I want to begin by asking our panelists individually a question to kind of set the groundwork for a conversation that will follow. And I want to start with Erica. You know, I've read your work and I've listened to your podcasts, and I really want to draw on what you've been arguing in your series of books about how we can think about xenophobia. You know, the moment today, if I talk to my students and I say, gosh, the moment today is so xenophobic, or they will say it's so xenophobic, and I'll say, wait, maybe not as much as we might think, right? And so I want to ask you if you can talk about the current moment in historical perspective, just so that we can kind of understand public sentiment before we get to the policy piece. So Erica.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for this invitation. I do want to point out, David, that in your invitation, you said choose one or two, historical moments. So, that's really not very fair or nice to ask a historian to do that. But I, like you, having to talk about these issues in the classroom is really so, it puts everything into stark relief. I mean, I do remember in December of 2015, speaking to my immigration history class. This is just when then candidate Trump had introduced this idea that he would call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims to the United States. My students had just finished writing a paper on the history of Chinese exclusion. And I stood before them and said, I can't believe that we're sitting here in 2015 and thinking about, a pretty serious proposal that would be more restrictive than the exclusion laws that you all just researched and wrote about. Little did we know that things would become, so much more restrictive in the years to come. So for me as a historian, there are clearly some high points in our long history of xenophobia and immigration restriction. Some of the ones that are the most, perhaps familiar with people who are in the audience are the Asian exclusion laws, the quota systems from the 1920s. For those of you who may not remember these from your own high school history classes, the Chinese Exclusion Act was, of course, the first federal law to single out a specific immigrant group for immigration exclusion based on race and class. Chinese were barred from becoming naturalized citizens. This really set in motion a huge campaign of terror that impacted generations of Chinese and Chinese Americans. They were driven out of cities across the West. They were beaten and killed. They were deported. This is the beginning of the immigration detention center on Angel Island. But it also led to a domino effect that then impacted every other Asian migrant group coming to the United States. By 1917, one of the general immigration laws puts into place what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone, which basically, very simply, by its title, barred immigrants from nearly all of Asia, an estimated population of nearly 500 million people. And we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and then 3 years later, the 1924 Immigration Act, which was known as the Johnson-Reed Act. These laws together legitimize discrimination on the basis of race and national origin and establish what was called the national origins quota system. So basically, it privileged a system that left the doors open to immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, considered to be the most assimilable and the best fit to be US citizens. It deliberately reduced all immigration from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, considered the racially inferior groups from Europe. It barred all aliens ineligible for citizenship, which basically is a code word for Asians who had been banned by the 1790 Naturalization Act from becoming naturalized citizens. In 1924, the US Border Patrol is established. In 1929, it becomes a crime to enter the country without documentation. In the 1930s, we see not only the mass removal of Mexican and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression, but also no way for refugees from Nazi Europe to enter the United States. The important point of this capsule history is that these policies lasted for decades, even though some of them, like the Exclusion Act, were passed as a temporary measure. And I think this is super important when we're talking about pandemic era policies that have been put in place as a 60-day pause, a temporary measure. Like Kathleen said, there's every indication that first of all, that these have already lasted far beyond those temporary timestamps, but that also they'll be harder to overturn. I know we'll get a chance to talk about what's happened during the pandemic and how that compares historically, but I do want to emphasize that it's not just this period of history that ended in 1965, that was this high point of xenophobia, and then another one that begins with Donald Trump. That period in between, the 65 to 2015, has been typically seen as a liberalization, right? The high point of immigration, because there have been record numbers of immigrants, largely, much more diverse from Asia, Latin America, Africa coming into the United States, but it also seeded a virulent backlash that that we could see through the 1980s, certainly with the battle over Proposition 187 in 1994 in California, et cetera. So that by the time Trump descends on the escalator and announces his campaign with the now famous, words about Mexicans being rapists and criminals, he's not inventing these on his own. He's really just building upon, perhaps much more explicitly than politicians before him, but he's just building upon a message that had been gaining traction for decades, and then really, if we think about this historically, had never gone away. So I'll stop with that. That was like 200 years of history in 5 minutes. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more to fill in some of those blanks.
That was quite the masterclass, as you said, in 5 minutes. Thank you, Erica. And I think you laid the groundwork for the question I want to ask Doris. We talk about, or Erica really talked about, this period up through 65 as being a period of exclusion and of rethinking the ways in which the United States would allow entry into the country. And she noted just in passing that there were, especially during the Depression and before, efforts to deport. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, Doris. You spent time in government during the Clinton administration, and I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the use of deportation as a policy, or maybe as a strategy, as we think about deportation, both as a mechanism to remove people, but also as a mechanism to potentially deter future entry. So I was wondering if you can talk about that, and then we'll ask Dara to talk about what's going on at the border today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and nice to meet all of you and be together in this session. Dara and I know each other, but the others of us are new to each other, so it's always nice to meet new people and get updated on all these issues. So on deportation, I think I'd like to talk about deportation through the window of detention, because detention is really the thing that has evolved as the mechanism to bring about deportation in interesting ways, and in ways that just listening to you, Erica, makes me pick up on a couple of points that I hadn't, quite thought of in the same way. So we can build on that. Let me just quickly give you a set of numbers and facts about the system today, what the detention system looks like today as a vehicle for bringing about deportations. We now, of course, have the detention and deportation responsibility vested with the Department of Homeland Security and the agency ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And ICE's big mission has to do with enforcement removal operations, ERO it's called. And as part of its enforcement removal operations, it operates today about 200 prisons, jails, and for-profit facilities of one sort or another, most all of it through contracts. That is part of that's their ability or their infrastructure for carrying out a congressional mandate, which calls for ICE to be funded to have 50,000 beds. And ICE and Congress has given ICE the mandate that 50,000 beds are supposed to be filled at all times. That is not to be a ceiling, that is to be a level of operations. And that number, 50,000, is one that Congress has gradually increased over the course of 2+ decades. So, so you have those 50,000 beds, but that translates to many, many more people, because the ICE detention system is one where people are moving through it as part of their immigration hearings and then as part of being deported. So although it's 50,000 beds, ICE touches more than 500,000 people every year. And just to put that into perspective, that is well larger than most other prison systems. I mean, that 500,000 people, if you look at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has about 158,000 prisoners, the largest state prison systems. California has about 117,000. Texas is the largest prison system in the country. That's about 142,000. So when you're talking about ICE and this immigration detention and deportation function, you're talking about handling very, very large numbers of people, larger than any other single system. Now, of course, they're very different in that those are systems where people have been convicted and are serving sentences for crimes that they've convicted. In the immigration case, the reason that ICE holds people is under civil law and for the purposes of people appearing at hearings or appearing for removal from the country. Many of those people are people that have committed criminal violations and have served sentences for crimes in state or federal prisons around the country and have been released, but released to the federal government, to ICE for removal because those crimes subject them to being removed from the country. But it still is a system that is very large and has grown very rapidly. It's tripled in the last 15, 18 years to a level of about $3 billion. And it is a very big operation. So how did we get there? What's the backstory that gives you that kind of a picture? I would say there are three big things that tell the story of how we got there. The first comes in the 1980s, in 1988, when Congress, as part of the war on drugs, actually, required mandatory detention for people who were non-citizens, who were convicted of violent crimes or of drug crimes. And so the first time that there is actually a mandatory requirement, and therefore the need for facilities and so forth to hold people, comes as part of the war on drugs, but it still is a very limited population of people in the scheme of things that would be subject to it. So that by 1994, for instance, you have about 7,000 people that are in detention, which is obviously a vastly different number from what I was describing to you earlier. The real change comes in 1996 with what we call the 1996 laws. The primary one here is IRA, which is the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Illegal Immigrant Reform and I never know the final. Anyway, the 96 laws. And so the 96 laws pick up on a point that Erica made, which is the backlash toward the large numbers, the large levels of immigration that were happening in the 1980s and 90s, particularly of people coming illegally to the country, and Proposition 187 in 1994 in California. Proposition 187 is a big inflection point in terms of what happened federally, because it led then to these 1996 laws when the Congress changed, when Republicans took over the Congress and the Contract for America, Newt Gingrich, et cetera, set in, and a major set of very restrictive immigration laws were passed in 1996 as a result. And those 1996 laws had many provisions in them, but among them was mandatory detention, continuation from 1988, but according to a list of crimes, aggravated felonies, far expanded from just violent crimes and drug crimes, as was the case in 1988. And one of the important things to note about this notion of aggravated felonies is that aggravated felonies is a legal term that exists only in immigration laws. It is not a term that translates into the criminal justice system. So you have a list now of crimes in the immigration laws as a result of the 1996 laws that is very extensive and that subjects many, many more people. The population, in other words, of people subject to removal was largely expanded. So you have that largely expanded population, and you now have mandatory detention requirements for which the Congress allowed the executive branch just 2 years to build up to a level of infrastructure that would be possible to hold those people in detention. And it's that combination of things that led then to this very rapid expansion of privatization of detention facilities and space, because the only way for the federal government to build up to meet that mandate was to contract with private facilities. Now, we of course know the parallel track that's going on in the criminal justice system at that point of much more privatization, et cetera. But the immigration picture is aligned with that picture. Then I would say the final major event is the post 9/11 era and the atmosphere of enormous levels of resources that went into the immigration system, particularly border enforcement and CBP. And where CBP's work is concerned, they're the next very important, I think, aspect of what explains the degree to which people are in detention today, is that CBP got enough resources finally in the 2000s, post 9/11 era, to be able to end voluntary departure at the border. In other words, the turnaround system, where you simply returned people back to Mexico because they were almost entirely Mexican young males looking for work in the United States, and instituted something that's known as consequence enforcement, which means that everybody that is arrested is charged with a crime, has an actual record, and if they try to come back again, that's a reentry that becomes a felony under this aggravated felony set of rules that was put into place in 1996. And so, again, there's a very, very much larger population subject to detention and to removal. Just as that all really begins to solidify, 2013, 2014 happens, and that flow begins to change significantly. So that what had been for 40 years, basically a Mexican flow of young single males, now becomes increasingly a flow from Central America of families and children. And those families and children are heavily mixed flows, in other words, humanitarian flow, as well as the classic economic flow, economic opportunity flow. And they're seeking safety. And they're seeking safety by applying for asylum. They have children with them. There are court decisions that prevent or prohibit detaining children for more than 20 days. And families and family detention, if they are with parents, is also in very short supply, because this whole infrastructure of detention that's been built up does not have facilities for families. And so that brings us to the point that we really are at today, which is a large flow of asylum seekers, some of whom are in detention when they are adults, but if they are with children and families, the federal government, as we know, tried to separate those families in order to be able to detain the adults. That, of course, had to be dropped. But now you have a situation where the large share of the flow, until Dara tells you about what happened at the border, and that's not a flow anymore because of COVID, is in alternatives to detention. But that then means that they are not going to get asylum hearings for several years. That adds to the ability to come to the United States, apply for asylum, stay for long periods of time, and that brings into play really the border crisis that we have today, which is an asylum crisis and inability to process those claims. And with that, I think we can pivot to the segue that you'll want to make to Dara talking about the border.
No, and that was tremendous, Doris. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much micro history going on in there that really helps tell the story. It makes me really appreciate the value of expertise, and then also regret the fact that our presidential debates aren't organized in such a way that there can be meaningful exchanges of discussion, right? The discussion of border policy in the debate, I think, got 4 minutes maybe, and there's no way to get at the detail and not even nuance. So I really appreciate that. So Dara, tell us about what's happening, if you can start pre-COVID, and then, as much as you've been following what's happening at the border today, I'd love to get your perspective, especially as we think about the ways in which COVID has, from my reading at least, really changed the nature of policy, right? That it's become a restriction based on health as opposed to restriction based on policies framed around remain in Mexico and turning caravans back, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really curious about your insights and how you think about migration across the southern border today.
Sure, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's spoken in previous panels and to my co-panelists who have basically given me a very easy job, because most of what I'm running through are things that have already come up in previous panels as we talk about the various kind of externalization policies that have been a hallmark of the Trump administration's approach, in particular to how it's dealing with this new demographic of asylum seekers that Doris identified. The thing that I think is important to understand, and that actually creates something of a continuity between what we were seeing a year ago pre-COVID and now at the border, where there is, thanks to the Centers for Disease Control and Protection, an order that officially prevents the entry of anyone coming without papers on the basis of they could be carrying COVID-19, and in practice, because it can't be a force field, allows for the expulsion without any recourse to the traditional protections of immigration law. So no ability to seek asylum or to say that you're fleeing persecution. But the thing that I think, despite the legal basis for that being totally separate from immigration law, and the Trump administration, in fact, arguing that it is totally independent of immigration law, and that's why it isn't bound by its legal obligation to not return people to places where they would be persecuted, both of them do kind of share the logic of expelling people off of US soil as quickly as possible. And to understand why that's important, it's important to think back to what Doris was saying about the changes to the increasing mismatch between people who were coming into the US and the physical infrastructure that was able to hold them at the border, the legal infrastructure that had been put in place for the purpose of, quote unquote, delivering consequences to single adults by charging them with crimes that would render it impossible for them to immigrate legally in the future. Because there have been extra protections built into US law for children who are coming to the US without their parents, that because in 2015, after the Obama administration attempted to make family detention widespread policy, the legal protections were expanded to require the detention, to end the indefinite detention of families, including children that were there with their parents. And because of the kind of fundamental international and domestic obligations for people who were seeking asylum and claiming that they were persecuted, the ability to, to deter was limited for obvious reasons. This was something that asylum law isn't supposed to be a matter of deterrence. There is supposed to be this is theoretically supposed to be a bedrock moral obligation. And the system has been built in a way to err on the side of permissiveness in early screenings, rather than run the risk that someone with a worthy case will be denied. It's very difficult to marry the logic of mixed flows and trying to balance deterrent measures with those kind of bedrock black and white humanitarian obligations. The Trump administration's response has been to try to find cases in which they won't have to honor those obligations and where they can exhibit a pure deterrent policy. And in practice, that means not letting people on US soil, or if they are allowed on US soil, getting them out of there in a short enough time so that the protections that are built in on conditions, the due process considerations don't necessarily apply. The CDC order has allowed them to do that to a much more effective, a much more efficient means than previously. Instead of having to guarantee people a court date through the Remain in Mexico policy that we heard about in the last panel, people are still getting expelled to Mexico who aren't Mexicans, but now they're being expelled without paperwork or without any promise of a future consideration of their claim. The interesting thing about this is that essentially returns people who aren't seeking asylum to the situation that happened before, to the policies that existed before the changes in the 1990s that Doris described, where if you are caught, you are simply informally returned, and it's not that hard to try again. And as a matter of fact, what we are seeing, and much of what's being reported as a sharp increase over the last few months in border apprehensions, is in fact an increase in the number of people who are trying to enter the US again after having been caught and expelled the first time. If you take that out of it, we're still looking at incredibly low levels of unauthorized migration into the United States. That does pose questions for whether quote unquote recidivism, or trying to re-enter after return, is in fact was supposed to be a goal of US policy to begin with. In theory, there are consequences that are no longer being levied on people. It also raises concerns about the safety of tactics that are being used for some reasons, some of which have to do with continued climate change and rising temperatures in the Southwest, especially during the summer, and to some extent because people have been more likely to try to enter the US through remote desert areas in times when there's been more stepped up border enforcement. We've already seen that this has been a record year for deaths in the one stretch of the Arizona desert that has had it, where there has been a concerted ongoing effort to document all migrant disappearances and deaths. And there's no reason to believe that wouldn't continue. CBP has also noticed a rise in the number of tractor trailer smuggling incidents that they've caught, which poses risks to migrants, including the risk of suffocation, or for that matter, an increased risk of contracting COVID-19 in a small, poorly ventilated space. The Trump administration does not see these as reasons to stop pursuing a deterrence-based policy. To the contrary, they actually have gotten more forceful in their rhetoric against migrants themselves for putting their own health and agents' health at risk by continuing to seek apprehension, even though they could be at risk of contracting COVID-19. But it's a foreseeable scenario given the extent to which the system is, as currently designed to prohibit people from asking for asylum, rather than being designed to, as the previous policy regime was, make it difficult for them to try to enter the US without apprehension and make it likely that they would be caught upon apprehension. The question is whether this is going to continue. And while there are very big policy questions involving the US presidential election, obviously, it's also frankly dependent on things outside the US's control. There is some indication that a lot of what was causing the extremely low levels of unauthorized migration over the spring and summer was that smuggling organizations had put a pause on their own operations to, protect the health of their employees. And so it's possible that what we initially understood to be a reaction to, lockdowns and difficulty in migration may actually just have been the shutdown of an infrastructure that's operational again. There are also questions about how other countries are going to be able to balance their own continued public health issues and economic issues with the mandate they've taken on from the US, as David and some of the other panelists were talking about in the previous panel, to not only, accept asylum seekers, which is currently on lockdown because the US doesn't have to, it can just expel people rather than even referring them to other countries, but to interdict people en route. We did see that the Guatemalan government took it upon itself to interdict a caravan of migrants that were coming from Honduras in the weeks after Honduras lifted its internal mobility restrictions. And there have been, there have also been reports of the US operating extraterritorially under these agreements with other countries that we still don't fully understand. But Mexican apprehensions have been lagging. They haven't really returned the ratio of people getting apprehended in Mexico to people getting apprehended coming into the United States is far below where it was pre-pandemic. And it's not implausible that that will continue because Mexico has been hit so much harder by COVID than the US, or continues to be. The other question, of course, is what will happen to Mexico itself, because the 1-2 punch of what was already a faltering economy and security situation and the pandemic may very well reverse what the movement Mexico has made toward being a place appealing enough for other migrants to perhaps want to settle, but more importantly, from the US perspective, a place where people don't necessarily feel the need to emigrate. Should that change, we would be going from a large percentage in 2019 when the most recent, when the kind of children and families phenomenon was at its peak, a large percentage of the populations of small countries, by some accounts, 1% of the population of Guatemala was apprehended at the US border in 2019, but that's still a much smaller country numbers wise, to a smaller percentage of a much larger and much more adjacent country. The Trump administration is already trying to make an effort to make it seem that if Joe Biden is elected, anything that happens after Election Day will be because people have been promised an amnesty. Their own analysis is much more agnostic and therefore much less dependent on the outcome of the election. And it is by no means clear that, not only is it by no means clear that the current restrictions would actually lift at a point determined by public health. We already know that the order wasn't signed off on to begin with by public health experts themselves, that it was something that was the mind of immigration policy folks at the White House and at DHS. So it's unclear that those considerations would be leading the decision to lift the CDC order. It's also unclear how long it would take for Mexico to reach a point where it was epidemiologically wise to create to reinstate more permissive flows between those countries. But it's also entirely unclear whether the US will respond to what could be another rise in single adult and or children and family migration by continuing to use this very blunt object, or whether there will be more of an effort to identify particular problems and to try to stamp those out as well in the whack-a-mole game that we've continued to play, where just as with the shift to families and asylum seekers, and now with the resumption of high recidivism, high churn, always attempting to fight the last war.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot for us to explore here. Let me invite the audience to submit questions into the Q&A box as I go through one more round or one question with the panelists. And this is for us to come back to COVID, or maybe not to come back to, but really focus on COVID for a moment. Erica, as the historian in the room, I wonder if you can tell us about, how, if at all, there is lessons learned about immigration policy when we think about COVID, in relation to the Spanish flu or other episodes where there was tuberculosis or other, other diseases that were thought to be foreign-born illness, for lack of better words, right? And how the United States responded to those. So very general kind of question, but really thinking about the relationship between COVID or infectious disease and migration.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I am literally the historian only in this room, but I think my co-panelists have done a fabulous job with the historical context as well. I know we've talked about this, throughout the day in terms of the just enormity of travel restrictions and pandemic related restrictions that have been justified in the name of public health, but also in the name of nativist policies to protect American workers, right? So one of the most important things is, again, context comparatively, but also context historically. The MPI, report that came out at the end of the summer had numbered 63 different immigration related actions that the administration has taken since the beginning of the pandemic. That's an extraordinary number. Some included travel bans that other countries had also put in place, despite public health experts that say that in a globalized world, border restrictions really don't stop an airborne virus. But the United States was the first country to also put in place immigration restrictions designed to protect the jobs of American workers. So this includes I think it's in April, the temporary, which has been extended, the temporary ban suspending visa lottery, family visas for parents, adult children and siblings, employment-based immigration visas. And when we look at this all together, these 63 different actions, as a historian, I have gone back to determine what did we do during 1918? What did we do during the Great Depression? What did we do during each one of the world wars? And it's very clear that these constitute the most sweeping immigration restrictions in American history. During 1918 and 1919, when the flu pandemic was spreading throughout the world, the US put in place only very limited immigration policies. One law actually expanded the provisions that restricted anarchists and communists, but others actually made it easier for certain groups to become naturalized. This is in contrast to one of those executive actions that this administration has put into place, which is a denaturalization effort. During the Great Depression, I talked about this before, nearly 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were forcibly removed from the United States. There were many nativist policies that allowed American citizens to have access to benefits and jobs before foreign-born workers. So that's a commonality. Of course, we kept our doors open during the refugee crises of the 1930s. During World War II, we forcibly removed, relocated, incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans. But even during these crises, the United States did not categorically deny entry to so many people at the same time. So right now we're talking border crossers, asylum seekers, refugees, skilled workers, students, and more. The other important aspect of what's happening today is like the other immigration actions that have been put in place by the administration, including the Muslim ban, the increase in enforcement, and the building of the wall. It's that they've been put in place by executive order without any input from Congress, debate, oversight, or approval. And recent statistics show that the second half of 2020 has seen a 92% decrease in immigration than the first half of 2020. So to echo Kathleen Newland from the previous panel, we do have to ask the question, will international migration survive? Right now, it feels like the end of immigration as we know it. And, you know, we have this election coming up next week, but the historical record shows that even if there is not a second term of the Trump administration, we know that undoing immigration restriction takes an enormous amount of struggle, sometimes for decades, and that recognizing what is, not only what is at stake right now, but the work that it's going to take to undo what's happening now and for the past nearly 4 years should really be quite sobering as we all mail in our ballots or stand in line.
Yeah, so Doris, let's take a piece of that, you know, sobering, unfortunately sobering and somewhat depressing conclusion that Erica laid, and see if we can turn that frown upside down to some extent. You know, Doris, you spent time working in government, and you know what Erica notes, and I think both Doris, you and Dara mentioned as well, is that the immigration policies that we've seen over the last 12, 15 years are mostly of the executive order variety. So I'm wondering if you can, you know, speaking from your experience and what you're observing, how would you advise a Biden administration, for example, in building a coalition such that immigration legislation could get through Congress? And again, this is something that I think Rebecca Hamlin asks in the box. She's asking about the top priorities of the Biden administration. Here, I really want to ask this question legislatively. You know, how do we move away from an executive order-based system to a legislative-based system? Are there areas where you think there could be cooperation? And again, all of this is predicated upon knowing who controls Congress, but you could take a shot at, you know, at different scenarios.
Well, here history is very helpful again. And so that there are two salient points. One is that even though we're an immigration country and immigration has changed us over the course of time, and particularly in the last 40 years, we legislate on immigration very infrequently. And so if we were to be legislating, I would argue, more regularly and adjusting, you know, as we go, which is best case, how you learn lessons and, you know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of a thing. You don't have that in immigration. You have, you know, these huge efforts that only come to pass every 20, 30 years. So the fact that we don't legislate regularly is our laws are out of date. They're not aligned with where we are at. And so therefore, we're asking our enforcement agencies in many ways to do the impossible. I mean, they're enforcing laws that don't make sense. And we can, you know, rail and rant all we want, and all of us do, about what CBP might do about this, or what ICE might do about that, or what, you know, this administration might do about this or that. But the fact of the matter is that Congress is the actor that's been missing in action. And so with Congress missing in action and simply not able to grapple with this issue because of the other historic fact, which is that we have lost a center in our politics. And when immigration laws do pass, they only pass with a bipartisan vote. And that is because within both parties, there is on the edges, both Republican and Democrat, typically over time, strong resistance, whatever the center can agree on. And we don't have a center anymore, starting, goes back probably into the 90s, but really became much more apparent in the early to mid 2000s. And you saw after the 2012 election a little bit of an effort to come up with a response to the 2012 election victory of the Republican Party becoming big tent, but that disappeared. And in that period, we actually had a bipartisan bill, 744, that passed the Senate, but it didn't go any further because the lesson then became double down on the base, and that's where we have been in really both parties. So the most important thing, and I think it's absolutely true, that unless Congress acts and updates our laws, our legal immigration system makes it possible for us to have many different, more pathways into this country for work purposes, for the fact that we're demographically aging, etc. We will have these huge swings. And if Biden is elected, we will have huge swings again in another direction on executive action, but it will be, and I agree with Erica, not complete. It will take much longer. There will not be the laser focus on this issue that the current administration brought to it. But without that, there are going to be these wild swings. And so the most important thing that could come out of this election where immigration is concerned is a different presidency and a different Senate. We'll assume that the House stays the way it is, because there is not a center if the Senate stays in Republican hands, and you have to have that center in order to do big immigration legislation, I would argue.
Thanks. So, Dara, Doris, let's take Doris's conclusion as a point of departure and think about either a Biden administration with a Democratic Congress or without, right? But there are so many other priorities up front. I'm really taken by one of the things you said in your opening remarks, which is we just don't know what's going to happen in Mexico, right? And we don't know if Mexico is going to be attractive to those who enter Mexico, perhaps as a destination, or perhaps remain there on their way to the United States because it's an attractive destination, or at least it was an attractive destination pre-COVID. So assuming that the economic and social and health conditions, south of the border continue to deteriorate, and assuming that we see an increase in trafficking or smuggling, even to levels that they were pre-COVID, what sorts of tools or policies do you imagine a Biden administration would have, or a Trump administration could turn to in order to monitor, to regulate the demand for entry at the southern border?
The Trump administration has put its externalization policies into hibernation, right? It's done nothing to dismantle them. And it's pretty upfront that should it return to a pre-pandemic footing by rescinding the CDC order, which again, no indication that it would feel any need to do that with any degree of alacrity, but that should it do that, it would reinstate the Guatemalan asylum cooperation agreement and pressure Honduras and El Salvador to get the agreements that they've signed, but haven't operationalized into operation. They also, Stephen Miller gave an interview to the AP last week in which he kind of floated the prospect of a global network of asylum cooperation agreements that would particularly target places where many from where many asylum seekers were coming to the US, such as Cameroon and China, which is certainly an interesting way to think about about where asylum seekers would be best placed who are being dispersed, and about who owes whom. Not to mention the relationship between asylum, which is often persecution of government and traditionally, and trusting governments to take care of other countries' asylum seekers. But the Biden administration, should Biden get elected, would face a question of how much to unravel what has been put in place. Which, that's not to say that the Trump administration would be able to keep the numbers as low as they are right now, but that they have assembled a comprehensive enough policy of externalization, particularly against asylum seekers, that as long as that continues to be their target population, they should be satisfied. Biden as a candidate has not promised explicitly to undo the CDC order. He's taken a kind of wait and see approach. And as we've heard from other panelists, things that are indefinite, but supposed to be temporary often end up being not so temporary. But he has promised to undo MPP, which was the most widespread pre-COVID externalization policy. There are questions about mechanically how you would do that, that do implicate how much more of the externalization framework you're going to be unraveling. But also, as you said, David, it's the circumstances on the ground are not going to be the circumstances that they were in May of this year. And it does appear that the balance we saw the Obama administration attempt to strike, where there was some attention to the humanitarian needs, to balancing the humanitarian needs of migrants, but where they were trying to wedge those into a framework where they were also engaging in a deterrent strategy, that there's certainly evidence that that conflict hasn't been resolved within Democratic policymaking circles, and that there is, I think, a concern that the border is a distraction from the core of immigration policy that Democrats are enthusiastic about changing, which is addressing the status of people who have settled in the United States. That is also similar to what we saw in 2014 when the Obama administration put its planned review of internal enforcement policies on hold because it was dealing with the rise in unaccompanied children coming into the US. Policy-wise, those did not have to, it's not like there's a single track along which policies can be developed in the Department of Homeland Security, but politically there was a decision that they were more vulnerable on the border than they were with regards to internal enforcement. And so it was inconceivable that they could take a permissive approach in both regards.
Right. So we have about 3 minutes left. And so I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to put the three of you on the spot, really because I'm interested in engaging your reaction. So when I watched the debate on Thursday night and they asked Biden the immigration question, in his first two sentences, he said something akin to, well, we need to figure out pathway to citizenship for the 11 million who are living in the shadows. My jaw dropped to the ground. Okay, I was stunned. Erica, Doris, Dara, what was your response? What was your immediate kind of response when Biden said that? And do you think there's any chance, even with a Democratic Congress, that this moves forward?
So first,
Erica.
Kudos that you watched the entire debate.
Well, my son is in AP government, and I didn't want him to have to watch by himself.
I know. To me, it's not a surprise. Actually, it's about time. If I get asked the question a lot about, this question about change, right? How did we get here? What's different today? And one of the big things that is different today is that, of course, there's been these sweeping immigration restrictions, as I said, the most, I think, in American history, but also the challenges and the protests have been nothing like we've seen in the past. There were no marches in the streets when the Exclusion Act was passed, when Mexicans were being removed, when Japanese Americans were taken from their homes. And what's been different from 2017 on has been this massive outpouring of coalitions. There are, at the child separation protests, there are people from the No Muslim Ban, organizations like CARE, marching alongside. It's not just one group marching and protesting the laws that impact only them. It has been, and it hasn't been just immigrants and refugees either. So that has clearly, I think, shifted the whole conversation about immigration, away from the right, more towards the center, and moving to the left, more so than ever before. You see signs about abolish ICE that, would have been, I don't think, as widely seen, certainly in the 1990s or after 2001. So that is what has changed, and I'm pretty sure that people will be waiting for Biden to fulfill that particular promise.
All right, Doris and Dara, we're at 1 o'clock, so quick reaction.
Yeah, I was not surprised. I think he certainly will try to do it. It's definitely critical for his for part of the Democratic constituency. And I think that if he tries legislation, look for it as part of COVID relief rather than in an immigration bill, because the thing that we've seen during COVID is how essential immigrants are to the lifelines for all of us.
Interesting. Thank you. Dara, last word.
I mean, all of what Erica and Doris have said is correct, but I would say that there has been a marked change from the amount of mobilization over family separation in 2018 to the amount of mobilization over the externalization policies of 2019. And to the extent that there has been a clear message sent that public opinion can be mobilized to care about immigrants who are being held in custody, and that is seen as the US's responsibility, that responsibility does not appear to extend beyond US soil, that is both relevant for what an immigration bill could look like, and for what the potential is for how what's going to continue to happen at the border might change the domestic politics of immigration on the ground.
Terrific. Well, I really wish we had another 3 hours to dive into all of this in a lot more detail. And I hope that you will come back and join us at the Miller Center as we follow up from the election, and then, think 6 months, 12 months into the next administration, whether it's Biden or Trump, what progress has been made in these kinds of policies and conversations. So Dara, Doris, Erica, thank you so much for joining us on this panel. Let me thank the other panelists for joining us earlier in the day. And again, thank you to Brian for giving the keynote presentation. Let me thank the Battle family for their support of this conference. A deep thanks to Stephanie Georgopoulos Abbott and Alfred Reeves for really just making everything happen. We couldn't have done this conference without them following up on every little detail. And the same goes for the Miller Center communication team. Thank you to Anne for working with me on this project. It was a true partnership, and it's been a great amount of fun. Any last word, Anne?
Thank you to the Miller Center team. We really appreciate it. And one of the things we learned in putting this together is there's the audience that numbered 150 at the start of the morning. And then there's the audience that will watch this again. And so I want to assure the panelists that their words are very keenly being listened to, and will definitely be used by the fans of the Miller Center and by the UVA community. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a terrific afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.